Welcome back to the Politics and Media programme. The Leveson inquiry into press standards may advocate legal regulation. That's certainly what the 40 MPs who wrote to The Guardian last week are recommending. But would this just increase the level of political control over the press without solving the issue of corporate control of the press? Or is there a need for it to hold the press to account for unethical behaviour, such as promoting Islamophobia? Let's have a look at this interview that Carl Arundel did with the Deputy Prime Minister last week about the issue of press regulation.
Do you agree with the need for a far more robust regulatory body, and will your government be giving its full support to such a measure if it's proposed?
I think there is an issue about how Islam and indeed the role of Muslim communities in Britain is portrayed in parts of the press. It's one of the things that the working group that I've established within government, the cross-government working group, is looking at in its early work. I can't, of course, prejudge what Lord Justice Leveson will come up with in terms of his wider remit to look at, how the media is held accountable when things go wrong. My own view is, assuming that his proposals are workable and proportionate, we should, of course, seek to support them and implement them.
Well, joining me in the studio are Brian Cathcart, Professor of Journalism at Kingston University and founder of the Hacked Off campaign, Peter Oborne, Chief Political Commentator at the Daily Telegraph, and on the phone we're joined by Tim Crook, Senior Lecturer in Media Law and Ethics at Goldsmiths College. Welcome to you all. Brian, so regulation, good idea, bad idea?
I think there has to be change. You'd have to say that the press has argued for years and years and years that it has had its own form of regulation. It just hasn't worked. They have claimed to regulate themselves, the papers, but in fact the Press Complaints Commission, which has been there to do that job, has simply failed to oblige, mainly because it was designed to fail. And so I think we need something, and I think there's a huge public demand to see something that is effective and that makes editors and proprietors accountable for what their newspapers publish.
Peter, do you think this is the way to go?
Statutory regulation.
Yeah.
I don't think so. My instinct is against that. I don't believe that in government control of the press. And I think it's very important to remember why this inquiry was set up. It was set up because of, I'll speak carefully, but the allegedly criminal activities of one newspaper group, News International, the Rupert Murdoch Press. And if everything had worked as it should have done, if the police had done their job and prosecuted the alleged crimes they discovered, there wouldn't ever have been this scandal. It's really a failure of the police to enforce the law of the land at a time when the senior people at News International were very, very close indeed to the political leaders of our two main political parties. And that was the problem. I think even Brian will agree with that. And to create the solution to have introduced statutory regulation of the press has nothing to do with the problem at all.
OK, Tim, you've got some sympathy for that argument, haven't you?
Yes, I think what is described as statutory underpinning or regulation of the print media would be disastrous constitutionally, largely because I trust politicians and judges less than I do journalists, editors and proprietors. And I know I'm talking about the difference between the devil and his helper or the deep blue sea, but if we get thrown into the deep blue sea, I think there's a danger of liberty and freedom drowning. I actually think the Press Complaints Commission has been unfairly traduced and condemned. I think in its operation it settled and provided solutions for more people than it failed. And I suppose it could be seen as a failure if the scandal and problem then went on to law. I'm coming from a liberal libertarian tradition. I certainly agree with Brian Cathcart and the critics of the print media that something should be done. But I would offer a more pacific, constructive solution. For example, restorative justice conferencing, encouraging media institutions to have readers, editors, or ombudspeople. And more particularly, I think we're going to improve journalism if we, in fact, give our media a more freedom and a greater balance in relation to media law. And I think libel, privacy and contempt need to be rebalanced. I think actually the criminal behaviour that's being alleged was the result in a very small minority of our media operations of cutting corners to try and find the evidence to defend in the libel arena where claimants are so much favoured. And then we have a development of privacy law as a result of so-called statutory underpinning. And that has gone on the basis of prior restraint, mainly in secrecy.
Okay, well, let me bring Peter back in here, because, I mean, okay, you were saying the law was there, but the law didn't work. Tim's suggesting that there should be changes to the law to make it more effective. Would that be something that you would also welcome?
I wasn't really following him. It strikes me that we do have very strong libel laws in this country. I think, if anything, they're too strong, but I'm not an expert. I don't want to get involved in that. And we have a growing law of privacy, which is new. I'm uneasy about that, but I support the European Court of Human Rights. I support, human rights legislation, very important. So what I take out of Tim is that there are very powerful laws enforcing responsible behaviour by the press. And I may add one other point, of course. It's very interesting indeed that the atrocity by the BBC in which they set out to slur the character in the most disgraceful way of a senior former Tory politician was carried out by the BBC, which is regulated left, right and centre by Ofcom.
Well, two things. First of all, I'm not advocating that politicians should be put in charge of the press. I am advocating an independent body that is independent both of the industry, so it ceases to be its own judge and jury, and of politicians. And we have lots of arm's length bodies like that in this country. It can be done. Peter raises the subject of the BBC and this appalling libel that has happened, and it certainly has. But look at what happens in the BBC when a libel like that happens. First of all, the Director General has resigned. 2 inquiries are already underway at the BBC. There is now a third. A regulatory process is underway which will look at what went wrong, will recommend changes so lessons are learned, and will allocate responsibility. Now, I'm minded now of the case a few years ago of Madeleine McCann, when a young girl disappeared, and among others, the Express group of newspapers subsequently admitted committing 110 libels against the parents of that girl. No single journalist was reprimanded, no editor resigned, there was no inquiry, there was no attempt to learn lessons, and as a result, more or less the same thing happened a couple of years later to a Bristol teacher, Christopher Jeffries, who was wrongly accused of murder, and they simply monstered him. There is no process in the press for learning lessons, and I'm afraid the public is demanding it now. And what's more, you can't simply pass on and say that these people are, the collateral damage of a marvellous free press. We don't exist in that sort of world. These people have rights, and those rights need to be protected. One last thing on libel, there is a reform of the libel legislation going on at the moment. There is a much softer defamation bill going through Parliament. There's also a change to the law about legal aid, which means it is much harder for people wronged, like Christopher Jeffries and the McCanns. Both of them got no-win, no-fee agreements. It will now be much harder for people to get no-win, no-fee agreements. So people like them who have been wronged will find it far more difficult to go to court and get redress. So we are in a situation where injustice is being accentuated, not alleviated.
I mean, that's a very strong point.
I completely agree, by the way, with both your outrage and horror about both those cases, and there are others.
And many people watching this programme will make the case about things that have been said about members of the Muslim community.
We'll come on to the members of the Muslim, because I think
the Forest Gate brothers particularly.
Yeah, but I mean, just staying with these 2 instances, while acknowledging there are loads of others. Of course, I can't defend. I'm not trying to defend the Press Complaints Commission. Of course, it's got to be much, much more independent. It's got to be independent of the press. I can agree with that. Where I think we take issue, but again, is if you're putting it on a statutory basis, you're starting to move towards government control. Now, it's very, very sinister. It's the beginning of something, that too, because once you've given government an element of control, the use of statute to control the press, it will never take it back. It'll just increase it. And press freedom is fantastically important. But I think actually you made a very, very important statement there. I mean, the cases you raised are devastating. They're utterly shameful, and one has to get into a situation. And one of the problems with the Express newspapers, which you mentioned there, of course, is they wouldn't even join the PCC, so I don't think it's a case for a different form of regulation, but not for statutory.
Tim, let me just bring you back into the discussion here, because I mean, we're touching on some broader questions now. I mean, Peter said in his first contribution about the politicians and the press being too close. We're now talking about the Savile case and the BBC. There's something happening here with the public perception of what's happening at the highest levels of political power in this country. Do you think that any kind of regulation like this will begin to address the depth of the problem?
Not statutory regulation. I don't actually agree the current Defamation Act is going to liberalise libel for the media at all. I think it's just going to consolidate what's happened in terms of case law. There is a chilling effect generated and rippling out from libel and privacy. And I think statutory regulation underpinning of the print media would do the same thing. I'm sorry I didn't make myself clear to Peter. My position, and I know Brian understands where I'm coming from, is that the wrongs of the media, a minority of the media, are being taken to be general. I actually think the Leveson inquiry was a bit like looking at the medical profession and then just running disciplinary hearings against bad doctors day after day for a year. And if that was to happen, most people would go and register with vets. I actually feel that our print media, our journalists everywhere have been dreadfully libeled, if anything, monstered. I mean, we're talking about Islamophobia. I think the public reputation of journalism has been severely damaged, and by doing so, by taking a particular things that go wrong and representing them as the general, and then saying that we have to have a charge to law, is disastrous democratically. I've been in journalism for nearly 38 years, and in my opinion, there's been a dreadful progression towards authoritarianism, and largely through good intentions. I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I remember in 1979 when the Sunday Times won the thalidomide case at the European Court of Human Rights, and the whole idea was to make it more liberal to report court cases while proceedings were pending, and we had the 1981 Contempt of Court Act. An attempt to statutorily underpin greater freedom and responsibility. Or in the end, what we had was the persecution of newspapers and journalists over their sources. We had a widespread outbreak of secrecy in the legal system without any right of appeal. I mean, the judges are out of control when it comes to unjustifiable orders, spreading out secrecy. And then in 1998, we got the Human Rights Act, and that was supposed to establish a balancing act. But in fact, legislators, politicians, and journalists and academics were talking about making freedom of expression paradigmatic.
Okay, well, let me bring somebody, Brian. I mean, Tim's point seems to be that it's a few rotten apples and the generality of journalists are doing okay. But isn't the problem with that is that it looked certainly within the Murdoch empire as if this came straight from the top and was a structural question, not simply bad practice.
I think there are structural issues here. I think at the same time, you know, I feel that. I still think of myself, I've been teaching journalism for quite a few years now, but I still think of myself as fundamentally a journalist. And I feel tainted by what's happened. But I want the taint removed. And I think as well that, you know, when we look at, for example, there's been a huge scandal over the past 10 years about banking in this country. Nobody imagines that every person involved in banking in this country is corrupt. And indeed, the banks have themselves been before the television cameras saying, look, 99% of what we do is a huge service to the community, makes the wheels of the economy turn safely, all of that sort of stuff. You know, we're looking at 1%. You can't monster us because of what 1% of, you know, high-flying, overpaid investment bankers have done. Now, actually, you have to, because you have to sort of decontaminate the brand. You have to rebuild trust. And it's in their interest that it happens as well. And I think it's in my interest as a journalist that we should be decontaminating the brand of journalism by giving the public better grounds of trust. And again, I repeat, I am not advocating state regulation of the press. I'm not advocating any government role in it apart from passing a law that creates a regulator that is at arm's length from government. It's not a slippery slope. It's actually a matter of, because we're not in a high place to slip from, we're in a low place. We need to climb out of it.
Peter, what about this question of a sort of broader problem in the political culture? Because, you know, just in the course of this conversation, and any conversation like this on the top of a bus or in a pub, we'll go through it. We'll go through the press, the politicians, the police, the banks, and if you look more scientifically, if you look at the British Social Attitude Survey, public faith in practically all these institutions is tanking. Do you think that any of the available solutions inside is going to do the business?
Yeah, by the way, I hope we are going to talk about Islamophobia in this context, but I'll deal with because there are a lot of very important things to say, and I think it tells us there are different lessons to be drawn from what we've been talking about so far. But clearly, it is amazing in the last 5 or 6 years, you know, MPs, there's another one of them, a real shyster called McShane is the latest, who all the people on the left liked a lot. To remind us what was going on, it was really disgusting. I mean, what went on during the Blair years, the stealing, the lying, the fabrication. I mean, the reputation of Parliament has not recovered. Then you had the police, who've got massive issues to answer and weren't properly addressed, I think, by Lord Justice Leveson. I think that part of the
I think they'll feel when the report comes out they were well and truly done over.
I don't think they will. Not judging from the questions. In my conversation with Lord Justice Leveson, he was very respectful about the police accounts of why they failed to investigate properly. But you've had advanced sight of the report, so you know. Then we have the issue of banks, who I have to say nobody's explained to me what they're supposed to have done wrong. I mean, obviously they've created a financial crisis.
Crashed the world economy, some people say.
And there's clearly something. And actually, somebody at some point is going to ask questions about the army. We're just emerging from two stupid and losing wars in succession. And I don't think that in British history has happened since maybe the Boer War. More than 100 years ago, and one can go on. I mean, and the intelligence services, this business of torture, and one go on and on and on.
Well, those two last things are directly related, I think, to the question that you were saying about Islamophobia. So let's just talk a little bit specifically about this. I mean, this seems to be a kind of, you know, runaway issue in the press that nobody wants to really take by the horns. Is that a fair comment? Do you think?
What? Sorry,
it's a kind of runaway.
Islamophobia. I think that it's far more serious issue in this country. I know this is something which Mr. Cathcart and I will agree about.
Absolutely.
And that's nice to find something we can do. But I mean, I think it's a far more serious issue than is acknowledged. And I think the main reason, it's utterly shocking, the scale of Islamophobia in this country. If you talk to a Muslim, you will find they've been spat on, they've been abused. They take it for granted. And just on the bus or something. It doesn't mean that all British people are Islamophobic, but there is a culture on the street of that. Burning of mosques hardly gets reported. And then, of course, in the papers themselves, there's stereotypes created. Things are said about Muslims, which could never be said about Jews or homosexuals. And I submitted my report on Islamophobia to Lord Justice Leveson. I know the Islam Channel did, and I hope that he will look at this, because I think there are things, urgent things that need to be done.
Let me bring Tim back in. I mean, Tim, obviously this is an issue of considerable concern. A couple of weeks on the program, a couple of weeks ago on this program, we had journalist Richard Peptit to resign from the Daily Star over this kind of thing. So it's a kind of current issue. Well, what would you say should be done if regulation isn't the thing? What should be done about this issue now?
Well, there needs to be education. There needs to be leadership. Certainly, the media industries can do their bit. Press complaints, failed version, press complaints commission, new version, whatever. We certainly do it in our university. When I teach media law and ethics, I look at the monotheistic religions and I refer to their holy scriptures as significant sources and influences on the debate between good and bad. Religiosity is something that needs to be respected just as much as politics and human rights and toleration of people's creeds, values, and even prejudices. You know, we've been here before in relation to the abject, miserable, and disgusting persecution, insult of minorities. And I think it's something that can be overcome. But it's we need powerful people and powerful institutions to take responsibility. I'm not just talking about the media.
Okay, Brian, as a current sort of live issue about the state of the press, what would you say should and could be done about this?
Well, I think having an effective regulator, while it won't specifically address Islamophobia, or I wouldn't expect it to, it would specifically address issues of fairness and accuracy. And actually, they're at the heart of what the problem is. If reporting about Muslims in Britain isn't fair or accurate, then it should be possible for Muslims to go to papers and say, we want this corrected, we want to write a reply, we want to get our word in and try and rebalance the debate. And I think that's possible. I mean, I would echo Tim that I think that the next generation of journalists who come out of universities will, the young ones coming out now are more versed in the complexities of working in a diverse society than their elders, who are shockingly and overwhelmingly white in the national press. And I think we can see a balance. We teach, and I know that Tim does as well, diverse students. There's a great interest in being a journalist among the ethnic minority communities.
Let me just bring Peter in there, because I know that you're speaking at the media conference that's taking place at Tim's College at Goldsmiths on Saturday. Do you think there's fundamentally there's a point where the journalist, like the guy on the Daily Star, has to say, this is rubbish and I'm not doing it? Do you think?
Well, we are all morally autonomous human beings equal before God. I hope that we do have individual journalists have a sense of right and wrong and ability to act on it. The fact about human nature is we know that many people don't or aren't prepared to exercise that faculty. And so you need to have systems and institutions which are going to act when, for instance, Muslims are attacked unfairly.
So I'm going to have to leave it there because we've ranged all the way from the gutter press to high questions of philosophy, but that's all we've got time for today. So if you'd like to keep on with this conversation, you can join us on Twitter at Islam Channel CA. That's at Islam Channel Current Affairs, Islam Channel CA, if you want to join us on Twitter. But in the meantime, my thanks to my guests in the studio and Tim Cook at Goldsmiths, and I hope that you'll rejoin us in future editions of the Politics and Media programme.